Empowering Private Landowner Conservation. My name is Zach Bodane, the Policy Advisor for Wildlife and Lands at the Western Governors Association. If you're in need of any technical assistance, please message Amy Schweig through the WebEx application or call WGA at 303-623-9378. Before I introduce our moderator and panelists, I'd like to quickly describe the Western Governors Species Conservation and Endangered Species Act initiative and go over a few logistical details for the webinar. Western Governors Species Conservation and ESA initiative is the chairman of the initiative of Governor Matt Mead of Wyoming. Through the initiative, WGA is creating a framework for states to share best practices in species management, promoting and elevating the role of states in species conservation efforts, and exploring ways to improve the efficacy and efficiency of the Endangered Species Act. The initiative will involve an examination of the ESA to determine what's working and what's not, but will go beyond just a consideration of ESA and examine and highlight innovations related to species management and conservation and consider means by which state resources can be better leveraged. Quickly to go over some logistics, we're joined today by our moderator, Chris West, Director of the Rocky Mountain Regional Office for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. I'll let the panelists introduce themselves in just a moment. Quickly, each panelist will deliver brief opening remarks. Following those remarks, Chris will ask a few questions of the panelists to begin the moderated discussion portion. After the moderated discussion amongst panelists, we'll have an open question and answer session open to all attendees. All attendees are currently on mute, so please write your questions in the chat box at the bottom right and be sure that you have selected the option to address your chat question directly to me, Zach Bodane. Our goal is to have a recording of the webinar available on our website early next week. And again, for technical assistance, please message Amy Schweig through the WebEx app or call WGA at 303-623-9378. And with that said, I'll hand things over to Chris.
Thanks, Zach. Glad to be here. Hope that everybody is online and is able to hear, and the technical issues are non-existent this morning. But my name is Chris West. As Zach mentioned, I'm the Director of the Rocky Mountain Regional Office for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And the topic today is empowering private landowner conservation, and really a chance for all of us here for the next hour and a half or so to examine the role of private land in conservation, species conservation across the West, and really look at and take a deep dive into how to engage private landowners, private stakeholders of all kinds, and in addition to examining ways to help pay and incentivize those conservation efforts that go on around the West. A little bit of background on the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and why I'm here as moderator today. We are one of the nation's largest conveners and funders of conservation across the country with our mission to sustain, restore, and enhance the nation's fish, wildlife, plants, and habitats for future generations. The way we do that is by bringing together both public and private partnerships and investing in financial resources and intellectual capital in science-based programs that allow us to address those conservation needs nationwide and achieve measurable outcomes. We are a congressionally chartered 501c3 nonprofit with 2 regional offices in the West, the office that I oversee here in Denver, Colorado, as well as an office in San Francisco, California. With that, I'm going to turn this over to our first of our panelists, Amos Eno. Amos is the President and Executive Director of the Resources First Foundation, and he will present here, and then we'll be followed by Jeff Morgheim and Lesli Allison, and I will introduce them following Amos's presentation. So Amos, with that, I'm going to let you take it away.
Okay, first slide. A little background, in 1973, I worked in the office of the Assistant Secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and Interior, where ESA was drafted. It's the same office where Doug Wheeler, one of your previous panelists, worked. I also worked as an assistant to the Chief of Endangered Species in 1977 to 1980, where we designed many of the early species recovery programs which were successful. The most important point to bear in mind throughout my presentation, and a point made repeatedly by Alexa Sandoval of New Mexico Game and Fish in an earlier panel, is the original intent and focus of the Endangered Species Act was species recovery. Species recovery, not listing. So next slide. On the 1st of September, Judge Juneau in federal court ruled vacating the listing of the lesser prairie chicken. Judge Juneau's decision is a game changer. Why? Because it effectively hands the ball to the states as the leading agents for planning and executing species recovery. Next slide. The second point to make is to note the emphasis the court decision and Fish and Wildlife gave to the enrollment of private landowners as an essential component of species recovery. The irony here is for the last decade, the Fish and Wildlife Service has not made much progress in engaging private landowners in the conservation and recovery of listed species. Next slide. During the fall, Fish and Wildlife Service went back to court on a remand to have the judge reconsider his opinion. Next slide. On February 29th, 2016, Judge Juneau reaffirmed his decision, vacating the prairie chicken listing, and strongly rejected Fish and Wildlife Service's arguments for listing as being, quote, unpersuasive and unsubstantiated evidence. Next slide. And the judge characterized Fish and Wildlife Service's brief as speculative. Next slide. Since my audience is Western Governors Association, I'm going to focus my remarks on the West. And to understand the West, you need to understand the lay of the land, which many of our metropolitan society constituents most often misunderstand. Next slide. Private landowners are the 21st century market for conservation. In the lower 48 states, 71% of the land is privately owned. 82% of our wetlands are on private lands. Over 80% of our endangered species habitat are on private lands. Next slide. In the West, even with the huge expanse of public land, private land in terms of ecological and biodiversity value is 5 times more important than anywhere else in the country. Why? Because private landowners control the water that supplies our western metropolitan areas, all western agriculture, our transportation and energy infrastructure corridors, and virtually all our biodiversity, which thrives because of riparian areas and mesic meadows, which are largely on private lands. Next slide. In eastern and midwestern states, biodiversity is concentrated in forest areas, which again, like riparian areas in the West, are primarily privately owned. This next slide, it's difficult to read, but back in 1988, when I was running National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, I gave a grant to Fish and Wildlife Service's Michael Scott to create GIS gap analysis, correlating geographic mapping with biodiversity abundance. His maps showed that in Idaho, which is 68% publicly owned, with most of the public land over 3,000 feet elevation, all the biodiversity is concentrated in 6 regions, the darkest slide, the hexagons, of the state along the Snake River corridor and the Coeur d'Alene basin, which is all private lands. Next slide. Recent research demonstrates that for the last 30 years or more, our national conservation priorities have been a mismatch for biodiversity. Next slide. The vast majority of endangered species are in the southeastern states, Texas and California, not the Intermountain West and the Midwest. Next slide. A series of federal missteps in both policy and funding direction have created many of the ESA problems we face today. Next slide. First, Secretary Babbitt's attempt to create a national biological survey in the mid-1990s led to the removal of the research division from the Fish and Wildlife Service, whose leadership today regularly bemoans the lack of research to substantiate their policy initiatives. Next slide. One of the principal litigants for listing more and more species is Defenders of Wildlife, whose CEO is Jamie Clark, who was Babbitt's Director of Fish and Wildlife Service and a leading proponent of the National Biological Survey, and Don Barry, Defenders were vice president, was Babbitt's assistant secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and again, a promoter of the National Biological Survey. I'm not sure this is a coincidence. Next slide. The second misstep is Partners for Fish and Wildlife. It's Interior's only program that partners with private landowners. It was started with National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grants that I made in the 1990s. This administration, while pushing listing for species whose habitat is predominantly on private lands, has simultaneously de-emphasized the partner program and reduced funding. And the reality is much worse than the bar chart, as the partners program in every fish and wildlife region is the regional director's slush fund for other program priorities. Next slide. USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service Sage Grouse Initiative is the only federal program that has made cooperation with states and collaboration with private landowners a priority and a core value with an on-the-ground, disciplined implementation. It is the reason the greater sage grouse was not listed. It represents a pathway to success. It is both all hat and all cattle, to borrow a Western phrase. Next slide. The federal vacuum in leadership on endangered species recovery is being comprehensively filled by states. Today, states have better research, better cooperation with private landowners, better outreach to corporate landowners, and better on-the-ground management. Next slide. The best exemplar of state leadership and success is the WAFWA, that's the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, led recovery effort for the lesser prairie chicken. The WAFWA recovery plan was endorsed by the Fish and Wildlife Service in the fall of 2013, but then the service listed the prairie chicken in May of 2014. In less than 14 months of implementation, WAFWA has brought in 180 companies, which have enrolled 11 million acres in conservation. WAFWA has raised $51 million for habitat conservation. These are unprecedented victories. $51 million for conservation, and the investments coming from oil, gas, wind, and utilities for species conservation. Fish and Wildlife Service has never done anything comparable in 43 years since the original passage of the Endangered Species Act. I recently asked a leader in the Secretary's office, so what if Judge Janelle had ratified the service's listing for prairie chicken and it was a listed species today? How much funding would Fish and Wildlife be committing to recovery? His response? Probably less than $500,000, maybe $100,000. So ask yourself a few more questions. Would you have better research if the species was listed? No. Better monitoring? No. Better partnerships with the private sector? No. Better coordination with states? No. With private landowners who own 95% of prairie chicken habitat? No. Next slide. The oil and gas community, the greatest bogeyman of environmental activists, has been a principal supporter of the WAFWA plan and prairie chicken recovery led by the Permian Basin Petroleum Association. This too represents an unprecedented success for public-private cooperation. Next slide. Let us look at a few other state-led success stories. Utah's Watershed Restoration Initiative. Recall that all western biodiversity is concentrated around riparian areas. Utah's WRI has restored 1.2 million acres of habitat for wildlife with 122 partners and $160 million invested in 1,400 projects. Next slide. Utah's program is based on partnership with private landowners, ranchers, and corporate landowners. Next slide. In terms of Western local government success, nobody stands taller than Gunnison County, Colorado. It's the only county in America to have hired a full-time biologist, ex-Fish and Wildlife at that. It has enrolled over 90% of private land in conservation. It closes roads seasonally to protect sage-grouse leks, and it's led the effort of adjoining counties, 9 in all, to formalize a range-wide conservation plan for the Gunnison sage-grouse. Next slide. Gunnison County is working closely with NRCS's SGI 2.0 and is making on-the-ground progress daily for the recovery of Gunnison sage-grouse. And as with the prairie chicken and state-initiated conservation efforts, Fish and Wildlife, instead of supporting state efforts, listed the Gunnison sage-grouse, and as a result, Colorado is litigating their decision. Next slide. Lastly, let me mention Texas, one of the only state fish and game departments with an entire division devoted to collaboration with private landowners. Texas Parks and Wildlife Department has over 30 million acres enrolled in conservation projects. Texas is 95% private land, and the state is a living model of 21st century conservation and partnering with private landowners, from the eastern forests to Gulf wetlands to western prairie ranches. And today, I don't have a slide for this, but Fish and Wildlife is announcing that they're not listing the fisher in western states. And this, again, provides another example of successful conservation by states and private, in this case, forest landowners. Next slide. How does my foundation fit into this picture? For the last 15 years, Resources First Foundation has been building conservation web portals to engage and assist landowners in a myriad of conservation and stewardship opportunities on a scalable basis. Next slide. The past 2 years, we built a conservation habitat management portal to help implement the WAFWA recovery plan for prairie chickens and the implementation of the sage-grouse conservation initiatives led by the 63 working groups throughout 11 western states. Next slide. Last year, we built our newest state conservation center for Idaho. Next slide. Currently, and thanks to Chris West's organization, my alma mater, National Fish and Wildlife, we're building the Colorado State Conservation Connection. Next slide. We're also building the mother of all states and an endangered species hotspot, Texas, the Lone Star Conservation Connection. Next slide. In 1973, when the Endangered Species Act was passed by Congress, no state had an endangered species program. There's been a lot of progress in 43 years, and today, endangered species are a statewide embedded phenomenon. Where does WGA take this endangered species cattle drive that Governor Mead is leading to a policy corral? Well, to me, the answer is obvious. You build on obvious, demonstrable success with a capital S. To borrow a line from Mr. Trump, let us make America and species recovery great again and make success a model. This takes you to Section 6 of the Act, where you can build on the success of states from California to Texas, Utah to Colorado, and their record of bringing about recovery for both species and habitat. Next slide. The Endangered Species Act is not the unassailable castle it's often depicted as for congressional policy reform if you base policy change on demonstrable success of conservation implementation. And Section 6 is ripe for significant policy expansion and enhanced funding. Next slide. In a previous WGA panel, which included the lead litigating attorney from Defenders, all 4 panelists recommended expanding Section 6. My final slide quotes from 2 of those former panelists. John Lesli was Secretary Babbitt's solicitor, and he said, the Act, I quote, "The Act has failed to keep pace with important changes. The indisputable fact that states are now much more aggressive regards to species protection," quote. And the aforementioned Doug Wheeler, who had a lead role in drafting the original 1973 Act, said, today states are in a much better position than the federal government to affect species recovery, end quote. So let's take the endangered species to a field of bona fide recovery success where the quarterbacks of the states are current conservation leaders. Thank you.
Thanks, Amos. I'm going to continue moving along into our next panelist. Really thrilled to welcome Jeff Morgheim, who's the founder and principal of Edge Strategic Consulting, LLC. And Jeff has extensive experience professionally in the oil and gas industry during his career. And I think he's going to jump into discussions of how conservation finance and how conservation incentives might get paid for on going forward, and working with private landowners and providing the incentives that will result in on-the-ground conservation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Jeff, and look forward to seeing what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. And I want to first start off by expressing my thanks to the Western Governors Association for hosting this webinar and for allowing me to spend some time with all of you that are online and listening in to talk about something that's quite important to me, and that's finance. I'm a finance person, and I want to talk a little bit about an idea that I hope will unlock a lot of the initiatives that Amos is talking about and incentivize private landowners to conserve and for people to invest in those efforts and support private landowners in that endeavor. I want to commend Governor Mead for taking on this important topic, my appreciation to the WGA staff for the webinar, and my appreciation to Chris West for moderating, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel with both Amos and Lesli. I have an extensive experience with the oil and gas industry. I've been in it for 25 years, first with BP and later with Chesapeake, and now an independent consultant. And of the many interesting roles that I've had in my career, one of the most interesting was when I was the climate change director for BP. And you may ask the question, well, what on earth is somebody with a finance background doing in climate change? But it all revolved around emissions trading and the trading of carbon emissions by and between business units that were within BP. And we piloted the first carbon trading system within BP and ran a pilot and then ran it across our global operations. And much of what you're going to hear me talk about today is derived from that experience. I have the advantage of watching many people become instantly incentivized to find ways to reduce their carbon emissions and improve energy efficiency. And central to that effort was that we had a common currency, as I'm going to put it, for measuring what our efforts looked like. And this was the basis upon which people could go out and engage in a considerable amount of innovation at a very local level, but within a large framework. And this is a tool, a common currency that I'm advocating might be a way to link a lot of very different efforts together into a common framework. So with that, if we could go to the next slide. Thank you. So the big idea is, how do we develop a common currency for conservation delivery? We have something that will enable local, private, public efforts to move forward, but do so within a national, holistic, cross-species framework. We have many things that we can do. We have things that we want to do at landscape scale. We have things we want to do across multiple species. How can we create a common measure of all those efforts? There's many things that I could talk about in terms of conservation finance, whether it be easements, habitat exchanges, in lieu fees, many things that we can talk about in this webinar. But what I'm focusing on is, for all those efforts, what is the common way that we measure that effort, so that we can compare efforts, so that we can trade across efforts, so that private landowners and folks that have an economic incentive for helping landowners conserve those species have a way to measure across those efforts, because all finance efforts, whether it's bonds, stocks, loans, leases, buy this, sell that, buy low, sell high, or if you're kind of, you have my luck in the stock market, a lot of times it's, you know, buy high and sell low. But you have a common measure, and that's usually something called a dollar. And that common currency needs to be based on sound science. It needs to be driven by sound methods of measurement, and needs to be something that will unleash local innovation. We can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So the problem that we have right now is we have a lot of efforts, but we lack a common value to measure that conservation delivery. We have inconsistency of how agencies and other stakeholders determine the value of a species. And I know that some people may be uncomfortable with this idea of putting a value on a species, but without it, you face the next problem, which is we have species by species approaches, and this can limit efforts. There's efforts that we can undertake that could tackle multiple species, but the ability to look at a multi-species solution and compare it to another multi-species solution is constrained if we don't have a common way of measuring those efforts through a common unit of conservation value. And as I mentioned, we can't measure the delivery, and it makes it very difficult to integrate local efforts into larger programs. If we could please go to the next slide. So how do we do this? Fundamental to this is assigning a value to each species and applying a common method for calculating improvement. And much of what you see on this slide is deceptively simple. But this simple picture is the picture that we used at BP for driving an enormous improvement in our energy efficiency and reducing our emissions almost an entire decade before the targets that we had set for ourselves. So BP had set a target to reduce its emissions on a like-for-like basis by 10% by the year 2010. And through the incentives and through a common currency of valuing emissions, setting baselines, and measuring improvement, and then giving people a system to trade across those efforts, we were able to hit that target in 2001, 9 full years before the target that had been set, and did so at a substantially lower cost than we had projected, that our engineers had projected would cost to achieve that target. And so the formula is deceptively easy. It's unit value per individual multiplied by the improvement you are making over a baseline. And the graph that you see projected here on the slide has a red line indicating what would be projected as the number of individuals for that species over a period of time, the blue line indicating what is believed to be the result of making this investment with a private landowner, and the delta over time reflecting the number of individuals, additional individuals of a species that will be around as a result of those efforts. And so multiplying that unit value times that improvement is a way to then measure the conservation value delivered. So it's a unit times a quantity is a total conservation value delivered. Very easy on paper. The challenge is how do we get to the challenges in both parts of this equation, a unit value and how do we measure the improvement across a project. Next slide. Thank you. So the proposal that I am putting out for folks in this space to think about is that we build that common value unit, that we get the right people that are interested in this space to use sound science to determine how do we value a particular species over another species. All species are valuable to us. As Americans, as people that live on this planet, we all have a value that we put on having a diverse and healthy ecosystem with a lot of different species represented and thriving. We all want that. But when we have to make choices about Program A versus Program B, or we have an effort we want to take and one effort may help one species, but here's another effort that may help fewer individuals of the same species, but will also do good for other species. How do we bring those efforts together so that private landowners, stakeholders, everybody that's interested in this effort can compare efforts? And so a starter for the conversation is to make an amalgamation of factors, whether it's what is the relative ranking of endangerment by the IUCN Red List, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, looking at factors such as whether a species is a K-selected species, which means that it's going to take longer for its recovery relative to perhaps an R-selected species, or is this particular species a keystone species with many species interacting with it, or one that is an important species but has less connection with other species? How do we put those factors together to come up with a common value for what that individual means for the conservation picture? In the middle of the slide, it's then putting those factors together using sound numeric methods. I've been quite encouraged to see that a lot of efforts that have been happening in the area of banking and exchanges have been moving away from ranking systems that operate on a 1, 2, 3, 4 basis and are looking at more sound numeric methods, and I've been very encouraged to see that. And then finally, how do we measure baselines? And there is a degree of uncertainty in baselines, but as long as good science is being applied, as long as people can show a logic pathway for why that effort translates into something different than what is projected for that species or multiple species, we should be able to then measure the conservation value units and compare efforts across the landscapes. Next and final slide. Based on my experience with carbon trading at BP, we watched people make reductions in a variety of emissions, whether it was methane or carbon, through a number of different and creative ways. And it's my belief that by creating a common currency, we will be able to unleash a great deal more innovation in the conservation space. It's going to enable us to drive larger conservation efforts through a unifying measure. It's going to allow organizations, whether it's a conservation group, whether it's a private landowner, whether it's someone who's wanting to finance these efforts, or whether it's the state interests or federal, allow them to better measure and prioritize their efforts. It will also allow people to report their conservation efforts, not only for a single species, but their overall conservation effort across multiple species. I believe this will enable quicker restoration negotiations, because by having a common measure, it will enable negotiations over land restoration and water restoration to open a wider field of discussion for what should be restored. We can open the door to moving away from one-to-one restoration and looking for restoration that, from an overall conservation value perspective, makes the most sense for the landscape. And finally, having a common currency and a common ability to measure that value across baselines, I believe, will be a fundamental tool to incentivize financial institutions to come into this space, and eventually, when this would mature, possibly leading to trading, but at a very minimum will allow financial institutions to see conservation through a lens that's familiar with them, which is having a common unit of conservation measure. And that concludes my remarks for the panel.
Great, thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate that. And I'm going to move right along into our third panelist, who's going to provide perspective from the landowner and the direct implementation of conservation on the ground perspective. Lesli Allison is with us today. She's the Executive Director of the Western Landowners Alliance, and Lesli has a wide array of experiences on working private lands across the West, but is joining us today from New Mexico, where Western Landowners is headquartered. So, Lesli, with that, I'm going to let you take it away.
All right, good morning. Thank you, first off, to the Western Governors Association for all the effort that is going into this initiative and for the opportunity to participate. This is a needed conversation, and I'm pleased that we can be part of it. I've been asked this morning to speak to the experience of Western landowners who have voluntarily participated in the conservation and recovery of wildlife species. Next slide, please. First, however, I'd like to provide a brief introduction to the Western Landowners Alliance. We are a landowner-led organization advancing excellence in the stewardship of working lands, wildlife, and natural resources. And our work is founded on the following assumptions. Next slide, please. First, that working lands are an essential part of the Western landscape. Next, please. That healthy lands and economic prosperity go hand in hand. Next. That working lands and wild places and human communities all have a legitimate place in the landscape and must be considered together. Next. And finally, that the desire to achieve sustainable prosperity while conserving our lands, water, and wildlife for future generations is a common ground, nonpartisan goal. Next. As landowners and managers, we know that the foundations for successful long-term stewardship include knowledge, economics, and supportive public policy, and Western Landowners Alliance is working to strengthen these foundations. Next. I think the best way to understand and convey the experience of landowners who have voluntarily engaged in efforts to conserve and recover wildlife species is to take the next few minutes to share some of their words directly. Just to emphasize, these are landowners and managers who operate working lands, mainly livestock operations, and also support wildlife conservation and recovery efforts. These responses are just a representative sampling. So we'll go to the first one here. And every time I say next, this will be a different landowner writing in. These are ranches from all parts of the West. So the first landowner writes, we asked them, first, why have you engaged in voluntary species conservation? And this landowner says, first and foremost, because it is the right thing to do. Also, creating an environment that is friendly for wildlife species is one that in most cases is good for cattle raising. That is important because raising cattle is our livelihood. Next. Conservation is a way of life for us. State-based mitigation requirements have brought us personal opportunities to enhance the ranch for wildlife and place mitigation easements on it. We therefore provide ecosystem services and achieve economic return for our conservation ethic and commitment to the land and our family. Next. This landowner says, our perspectives on land ownership center upon personal responsibility to act as a steward of both the aesthetic value and natural resources of the landscape. Next. This landowner out of Utah said, our management paradigm is that diversity equals stability. Next. Another landowner said, we do this because the extinction crisis is one of humanity's most pressing problems. Next. And we asked what's been positive in landowners' experiences, and here are some of their answers there. The ESA provides economic opportunities to continue our ranching and conservation of the habitat values. Next. Another writes, our involvement with species reintroduction and landscape scale restoration has been extremely positive. We, along with seasoned professionals, have learned on a continual basis about conservation and ecology. We've enjoyed sharing this knowledge. Next. Another one writes, first and foremost, knowing we are doing the right thing for the land and for the generations that will follow us. And further, the partnerships that have developed from working with local, state, and federal agencies provide real opportunities to benefit from their practical and scientific knowledge, thereby further enabling us to make good decisions on the ground. Next. Next. The positives are seeing species that haven't been seen in years, although a shifting climate has a lot to do with that as well. It is gratifying to work with others on a trust basis and always nice to receive awards, recognition, etc., although that isn't a reason to do it. Next. We asked also what the downsides of their experiences have been. This landowner writes, while our efforts were well received by more management-oriented agencies, our efforts and presentations were not well received by some of the litigious NGOs. Our federal grazing allotment became a target, even though its management was rated as excellent by the managing agency. Next. Another says, ultimately, the landowners want certainty, yet experience suggests that the goalposts will continually be moved back, even after stated goals are met. Next. The process of navigating some of the Farm Bill programs that we have enrolled in can be confusing and time-consuming. Next. We are concerned by a consistent lack of urgency on the part of federal and state elected and appointed officials and relevant agencies to advance efforts to conserve biological diversity on large tracts of private wild working landscapes. Next. Processes are inconsistent, slow, and tedious, and sometimes conflicting. Next. The single biggest downside is the time it takes to generate the trust to become informed and to work through the bureaucracy at so many levels. Success can only be achieved in the long term, yet many challenges operate on far shorter time frames. Next. Negatives are worry about the unintended consequences of work that involves charismatic species and sometimes not so charismatic species. This draws the attention of those who wish to use ESA to attack activities, grazing for instance, that they don't approve of. As public land permittees, we feel especially vulnerable. Next. The lack of resources. Landowners typically find agency promises of support and partnering to fall short of what was promised at the outset. Also, there is a lack of follow-through, either due to change in personnel, change in administrations, or both. Next. And we ask what could be done to improve the experience and outcomes of voluntary species conservation. And we got a number of different great answers and suggestions on this, but the one that stands out above all is really best summarized by this landowner who writes, protection for folks who are trying to do the right thing is essential. There are a few programs out there, but they are cumbersome, and it's not nearly enough. Next. So we have some consistent themes that we found both in our polling and also just in our conversations with landowners and at kitchen tables around the West and our own experiences. And these consistent themes in terms of motivations are that landowners value conservation and wildlife. It helps them increase productivity and profitability, and they have a desire to do the right thing. Next, positive experiences consistently are pride in stewardship and outcomes, an improved bottom line, learning, partnerships, and collaboration. Next. Negative experiences, consistent themes are vulnerability or perceived vulnerability to litigation as a result of species presence, cumbersome and confusing bureaucracy, inadequate assurances on both public and private lands, inadequate agency funding, staffing, and support, moving goalposts, lack of political will for meaningful progress, and slow processes and time requirements. Next. Recommendations for improvement. These are consistent as well. Landowners should be rewarded, not penalized, for stewardship that supports wildlife. Involve landowners at the front end, not merely as enrollees. Improve and provide easier access to assurances. Fund agencies to better support voluntary conservation. Reduce bureaucracy. Increase cooperation between local, state, and federal agencies. Next. Reduce turnover and rotation of agency field staff to improve relationships and increase knowledge of local landscapes. ESA-related tools and insurances need to be consistent across jurisdictions. The ESA should be used to benefit species, not to oppose ranching. And we need to communicate the role and importance of working land stewardship to policymakers and the public. Next. So one point that's worth mentioning is that it may be all right for a landowner to get along with a southwestern willow flycatcher if the assurances are there and all these other things that we've discussed. But what about when it comes to things like wolves, grizzlies, and prairie dogs? They create a much greater conflict in working landscapes. And the input and experience that we have up to this point in this is that first off, there's a wide variation in landowner values, perceptions, and experiences on these issues. And specific contexts matter. There are no one-size-fits-all solutions. We need to acknowledge that conflicts and impacts are real as a first step toward finding solutions. Landowners should not have to bear disproportionate financial burden for species recovery. The society as a whole has a responsibility because urban, industrial, and recreational land uses, as well as large-scale crop production, have reduced available habitats. We need to keep working lands economically viable in order for them to remain intact and available to wildlife. And solutions are most likely to emerge from collaboration, but it takes time and relationships built on trust. Next. And that's about it for this, and our website is there. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leslie, and all the panelists. And I know that on the chat, there's an opportunity for everybody listening in to provide their questions, and we certainly want to do that. And we've got, looking at the time, we've got probably about 45 minutes here to allow for some back and forth between the panelists and those on the webinar. I'll maybe kick this off a little bit with a couple of questions for the panelists and then turn it over to the rest of the audience. I was really, I think, impressed by the comments that started with Amos, but also through Jeff and Leslie, about Western innovation and how this region of the nation is taking on a different approach to solving and at least addressing and beginning to address some of the species concerns that we are facing as a region. And maybe just start with the call that the changes need to be made, and maybe ask each panelist for the one single change that might be the most effective way for existing programs. Looking at what's already out there, what would be a single change that would be the most useful in your view change that could be made to something that a program that already exists that may be suffering from some of the cumbersome or inefficiencies that Leslie just mentioned of getting actual conservation done on the ground. And maybe start with that one, and then we'll see where this discussion goes. So I'll maybe turn this over. Let's do this in reverse order and let Lesli Allison answer that question first, and then proceed to Jeff and then to Amos on what single most change would be most helpful in your view.
So that's a challenging question to pick out a single change. I think I would have to say there are at least two that would have to go together. One is that we need to fund and staff the existing programs that we do have. A big part of the problem is that we just don't have the capacity in the agencies to deliver those programs, including particularly the assurance programs for landowners. When you need to get conservation done and we're dealing with time frames that have to do with extinction, you really don't want to be waiting for years for somebody in Fish and Wildlife Service to be able to help develop that program. They just don't have the staffing, and we hear from landowners all over the West that they'd like to see restored funding to NRCS and Partners for Fish and Wildlife, which are trusted partners. That funding and capacity is one major issue. The other is that we've got so many different programs out there kind of taking place over the same landscapes, but not always coordinated, and we see huge inefficiency in that. And a landowner may walk into one office and really not understand that the program they've heard about is located in a different office, or how those things flow together. So we need to streamline those programs and coordinate them better.
Yeah,
thanks, Leslie. Jeff, do you want to jump in next?
Yes, thanks, Chrissy. I am not I'm not from the same constituency that Leslie belongs to and represents, but I would very much strongly second what Leslie just said, and I would agree. Overlap, a lack of coordination, conflicting direction given on conservation efforts. I can say that my experience from the oil and gas sector side is, yes, in some cases oil and gas companies may own land, but in most cases they're lease holders and lease operators for oil and gas interests. But they express similar concerns that Leslie just stated, which is with multiple species, it's hard to track what's the priority, which one do we do next. I've got one thing that I've got one program that tells me to do, take the following steps, A, B, and C. I have this other regulation that tells me to do, in some cases, the very opposite of what I'm supposed to do in this other program. And so I think we need to get up to a landscape level approach, looking at multiple species, and being able to rationalize our focus, rationalize the programs, eliminate the duplication. And my hope would be that something like the concept of a common conservation value unit would be a tool that would help set those priorities, plan across multiple species and efforts to deliver those improvements that Lesli just expressed.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Amos, on to you.
I think that the single most important change would be to significantly expand the legislative umbrella for Section 6, and so that it allows states to be involved at the candidate and pre-listing level, so that they have additional financial resources for developing recovery programs, and that state leadership is involved in leadership in enlisting decisions. And then I would also agree with Lesli that increased resources for NRCS, for the Fish and Wildlife Partners Program, and I also think this is an arena that National Fish and Wildlife should join as an investment partner.
Thanks. Actually, I have a little bit of a follow-up question. So if Section 6 is expanded, Amos, what specific things should the states, if they're taking on an additional role or would have additional involvement, what would some things look like that the states should be investigating as additional tools? I know Jeff's mentioned some common currency around conservation. So I guess I'm turning this question back to each of you again. Is that what would those new programs that the Western governors and the Western states should be pursuing in kind of continuing to advance Western leadership on species conservation?
I think, it's Amos again. I think for the first thing you have to recognize is, I mean, the American West is a huge area, and the conservation objectives and challenges vary from state to state or region to region. I mean, even for single species like sage grouse, the issues facing sage grouse in the eastern part of the range are significantly different from the basin part of the range. So I think giving the individual states more resources to address the issues, and as I said in my presentation, I mean, states today have better research. They have better relations with local landowners and corporations. They can custom design the programs to the geographic region that needs focal points. And I think it's actually healthy that you have different states develop different solutions that are custom fit to what they perceive as their priorities, and less micromanaging coming out of Washington.
Chris, this is Jeff. Can I add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Please do.
Yeah, I want to add to what Amos said, and which is, when you have a common way of measuring things, you have the ability to unleash that innovation at a local level. You have the ability to say, here's the rule, here's a framework for a plan at landscape, but everybody understanding what those rules are for why this species versus another species, or this quantity of improvement here versus this quantity here, or this approach, you can unleash that innovation knowing that there's a common framework that allows that to be scored and measured. And it's what I observed when we were tackling greenhouse gas emissions, that even though the corporate headquarters set the framework, the corporate headquarters was not getting then down into the weeds with what individual people were doing within their own business to make a positive difference, and taking into consideration what's going on with my business, what's going on. I know my kit, I know my people, I know my team, I know my asset. I have the ability to put my plans together, and as long as I've got a common way of scoring it, it will all roll up to something that will be good and carry out the mission for the conservation effort.
Lesli, do you have anything to add on what new program or what new approaches should the states be exploring in the next stage of species conservation and innovation of Western states in particular?
Yeah, it's a complex question on lots of different levels. So I think sort of stepping back, looking holistically, not dividing between state and federal interests at this point. I think what we need to do is understand that society as a whole has really reduced the available habitat and the species. It's our cities, it's our large-scale crop productions, our industrial uses. These things have really limited the available habitat, and now there's more and more pressure mounting on private landowners to foster these species in the remaining habitat. And unless society as a whole is willing to take responsibility for their part in this, we're not going to come out with a desired outcome. It simply isn't going to work, because at the very end of the day, the economics have to work for these landowners. If they can't meet the bottom line, that property is going to be sold and subdivided, and we'll lose even more habitat. So we need to step back and look at sort of the big picture economics, and those are driven at different levels, both state and federal levels. And while there are markets developing, ecosystem services markets, we need to really think about, are we going to place the full burden of that onto a select few industries, or is it some way shared by the larger tax-paying public? So that's one of the first complicating issues that we see there. And so I think that any kind of policies and programs that we develop really need to start with helping landowners keep those lands intact and economically viable. As far as the state and local level of control, we completely agree that at local landscapes, the knowledge is there, the really in-depth acquaintance with the land. One of the most frustrating things that we hear from pretty much everybody is that people participate in collaborative stakeholder processes at local and state levels, and then at the end it may be overridden at the federal level because there's some other agenda on that table, and that's very frustrating. At the same time, I think we really support that wildlife is a national interest, that we want as a nation to conserve this habitat, and so we want to make sure that there are solid sideboards in place in which that can happen in a constructive way. So that's a bit of a long answer, but it's a complicated question.
These all are complicated. Thank you, Lesli. We're starting to get some questions from the audience, which I really appreciate. And I'm going to start with one that was actually directed to Jeff, but I would welcome the other two panelists to weigh in as well. And it's something that came up out of one of the species conservation initiative meetings that we had here in Denver last month, but really talks about how can we structurally move away from a species by species or a single species approach to conservation to a more widely applicable approach that doesn't reinvent the wheel each time and really takes into consideration maybe a suite of species that lives in a specific landscape or habitat type. And how can the common currency, Jeff, that you mentioned help form this broader structure on the ground?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I would say two quick things about that. Number one, we do need to move away from a species-by-species approach. Whether we're talking to many of the stakeholders in this space, including folks in the energy sector, agree that we need to raise our sights up further and begin to consider the totality of the landscape, and how do we put together approaches that will consider all the different species in play and develop a program that eliminates duplication or worse, conflicting goals with conflicting requirements for private landowners, for oil and gas interests that are operating their interests, or whether it's utility companies, transmission lines, and other users of the landscape. so that we can rationalize that into something that makes the most sense for the landscape. And then as far as then how does the currency unleash the on-the-ground work? Now that folks know what the currency is, when they know what the score, how the score is kept, that allows them to design programs that can speak into those broader programs and get that approval and that funding and that funds flow on the ground much faster than a private landowner or other interests saying, hey, I have a private landowner saying, look, I have some things I can do here with my land, but you haven't given me a tool for how to speak that into the wider agendas Leslie mentioned. There may be a bigger initiative out there. How can I communicate to it so that I can tap into larger funding that's been available for that larger effort, but be able to speak it very quickly into what I can do on my land today. And so I see a common currency as both setting very large landscape-based plans while simultaneously enabling on-the-ground quick implementation of conservation action.
Thanks, Jeff. Amos or Leslie, do you want to weigh in on that question?
Well, I think you can approach this, from a philosophical perspective, but that really doesn't get you traction, given the way the world works and what we have to live with in terms of political jurisdiction. And it's hard to generalize, but I mean, obviously, top-down federal direction and rulemaking and implementation are not working very well. And I think the one thing you can generalize is the closer you get to local political geographic level implementation, the better traction you get. I mean, Gunnison County in Colorado is a living embodiment of that. On the sage-grouse front, you have 63 local working groups that are each implementing distinct conservation initiatives. The other thing I think we need to look at from a national perspective that touches on some of the points Leslie made is providing a mechanism for restraining endangered species litigation from groups that live nowhere near the people who are impacted on the ground and are basically driving a regulatory process as part of an alternative agenda that they happen to believe in. But, I mean, local implementation is what works. That's where you get the unspoken and vastly unrecognized intellectual capacity of local landowners who know every acre of their land and are actually a much better source of information than outside science or the rotating personnel of federal agency managers.
All right, thanks, Amos. Leslie, would you like to jump in on that, or I can jump to the next question?
Yeah, in terms of the multi-species versus the single species, is that
yeah,
still where we are in that? So that,
yeah,
that is something that we have strongly advocated, understanding that there are single species requirements that need to be attended to if you're trying to avert an extinction. But absolutely, when you manage for a habitat, you're actually managing for a whole bunch of different species, and there's kind of a craziness ahead if we think down the line a little ways and see how many different listings may be on the horizon and that each one of those would be treated individually. Sometimes you have conflicting species needs within the same habitat, and all of this is overlayered onto complex working land operations in multiple jurisdictions. So it's getting to a point where it's just not going to be tenable for us to manage that way. Period. So yes, we would like to see going to a habitat-based, multi-species approach and recognize that there's going to be some challenges in doing that for sure.
Thanks, Leslie. I'm actually going to keep you on the hook here for the next question from the audience, which really gets at landowner involvement. The question is, the federal agency unilaterally decides what the science is under the ESA, for example, predicting an extinction of a single species. Do you have suggestions on how to get landowners' expertise, everything that's been talked about knowledge and of what's going on a property and locally on a landscape? How do we get that landowner expertise and that landowner knowledge involved in the system? So that, I'm going to paraphrase here, but really looking at landowner involvement on the front end of program development rather than as reactive participants to a situation.
Well, there's kind of a simple answer to that one, and that is that if having a species on your property is a positive instead of a negative, a lot of really wonderful things flow out of that, beginning with a willingness, for instance, to have surveys being done on the property, to flagging that, hey, I've got one of those critters. That should be a good thing, not oh no, we're out of business kind of thing. So if you just change that, you've gone a long ways into inspiring landowners to step forward to help with these biological surveys and help with the management plans and then help with the improvements that need to happen there. So I guess that would be number one. Two, we've actually been recommending in our recent set of recommendations that we consider more of a peer-reviewed process for looking at species and listings and the science behind those, and a more transparent process as well, so that we have the opportunity to weigh in on those things and test it out before we get sort of into the court side of that.
Amos or Jeff, would you like to weigh in on ways to bring landowners into the process?
It's Amos. I mean, I endorse both of the points that Leslie made, and this is a way of, I mean, bringing Jeff's quantification to the table. If you had a mechanism to quantify species, that could drive state and federal investments and reinforce the incentive of landowners. And secondly, I also agree with their point on peer review for species, and again, maximizing local involvement. So many of many of the listings of the Endangered Species Act, going back to the Tellico darter, where they found tens of thousands of them long after it was listed, have been flawed because the scientist who's making the assessment often lives hundreds, thousands of miles away and really doesn't know the local landscape. So building these people into the process at the local ground level, I think will be incredibly helpful, and there are a number of mechanisms to do that, but most of them, are best orchestrated at the state level.
Jeff, do you have any additional thoughts on landowner participation in this, or I can actually bring the next question forward to you?
I don't know how much more I could add to the question other than to say that, I believe that fundamental to whether we're talking about specific programs and measuring what is our baseline and measuring efficacy and determining the science, or in the case of measuring something where you're trying to measure something under a common currency, data is very valuable, and I believe that we should try to find programs and design programs that incentivize private landowners to participate in that data collection process, because it will do a great deal of good in designing the right policies, focusing on the right interventions, and putting into place the way to measure, are we making progress? So all I can do at this point is say, whatever we can do to incentivize private landowners to, as Leslie said, not panic when you see something, but instead see that as something of value, and actually be incentivized to look for it in your land and report it, I believe is the way forward.
Thanks. I've got another question from the audience here, and I'm going to just pretty much to read it as is. Does it make sense, or should we, under the ESA, label different species differently based on the threats, being those that are maybe threatened by, that are habitat dependent and threatened by a lack of habitat, versus those species that may be in peril due to historic overharvesting, or, for an example, the bald eagle, where it was threatened by an industrial toxin? Does it make sense maybe this is a question probably for either Jeff or Amos initially. Does it make sense to label species differently under the ESA based on those types of threats?
This is, well, Amos, do you want to take that one first, or I can take it?
Go ahead.
Yeah. You know, I think that the point, I hope that what I'd like to do is start a dialogue in this space of what a common value would be, because those were great factors that were just mentioned, and the idea is really what are those factors that we should consider? Not only, and a lot of those factors get considered into whether a species is listed or not, but those factors can also be used to determine the relative importance of conservation for that particular species. And so while the presentation that I've presented today has a set of factors to it, that's to start the conversation. But I do believe that all the stakeholders look at not only the current state, but what are the sources of threat, what are the mechanisms needed to either save that species or help that species recover and thrive. So it's about putting something together that would allow those factors to come together in some unified way so that those considerations can go into the value that collectively we're going to put on efforts to save that species A as opposed to a species B. And so I think those are additional factors, you know, call it, you know, the threat path, or how habitat dependent would be additional factors to put into consideration. So I wouldn't limit it, but I would certainly like to see people bring those ideas together and ask, you know, what are the key factors that go into why is it important that we should incentivize a private landowner to take action on this particular species or landscape as opposed to another species and landscape?
This is Amos. That's actually a good question. And Jeff, thank you for going first so I could pause to figure out an answer. Yeah, I don't think the answer lies in how you label the threat path of species so much as what has happened over the last 40 years, and particularly with the controversy engendered by the Act, is the agency sort of contracting its capacity for imagination, flexibility, and partnership. If you look at the early successes of the Act, and there's some pertinent lessons here that have been completely ignored for the last 20 years, but for example, bald eagles, the first hacking of bald eagles was by New York State, and a number of states followed through and replicated that success, helping to lead to a significant expansion of bald eagles. If you look at a whooping crane, the International Crane Foundation, George Archibald, bred whooping cranes far better than Patuxent and released hoopers back in the wild much more successfully than the Fish and Wildlife Service. Under peregrine falcon, the Peregrine Fund did the same thing. They did better breeding, better release in a superior fashion than Fish and Wildlife Service programs. California condor, same thing. Los Angeles Zoo and San Diego Zoo led the breeding program, the release program. The condor went from 20 birds when I started the program to over 300 plus today. The grizzly bear out west, the key ingredient was the formation of the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee, which allowed the states of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming to work on a par with the federal agencies to design comprehensive research, management, and enforcement that has led to the phenomenal success of grizzly bears in the last 20 or 30 years. You look at the recent listing of the long-eared bat, which is basically due to a disease, yet the service is implementing recovery based on the same traditional pathway of habitat and stuff, where probably a totally different approach is warranted. So I think, again, we need to step back and find more comprehensive solutions that really target what the threat is, who can we partner with or develop solutions that bring us to recovery rather than sticking to a formula that hasn't worked very well and is regressing as it has the last 30 years?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in too and just say it's very difficult sometimes to tease out one particular threat over another. They're often mixed up. Landscape management is complex, and so you might have a situation, for example, where somebody has identified the threat to a species as being livestock grazing, which in a drought year, compounded by climate change, may be significantly greater threat to that species than during a period of wet time. Or you have forest health issues that are really impacting the amount of forage available to livestock, to wildlife in the understories, and that's concentrating ungulates in areas where they may not have been concentrated before, and sometimes we think that that's livestock grazing when in fact it's ungulates responding to changes in forest health conditions. So it can be very, very complicated, and I do think we need a better way of looking at those, because so often what you see is what's left on private lands, because the primary land use is grazing, the threat is identified as grazing. And I do think it does merit looking a little more holistically in those situations.
All right, thanks, Leslie. Another question from the audience here is, how do you make sure to bring the NGO environmental community into alignment with state or local efforts so that the conservation doesn't devolve? How do we, and this I think may get into some of the questions about certainty as well, and instead of making the existence of a species on a landowner's property a good thing and not a vulnerability. So there's sort of two questions wrapped up in there. But maybe, Leslie, do you want to take a crack at that one initially on bringing along the environmental community so that a landowner participation in a program or landowners even doing something as simple as allowing for a survey doesn't open them up to additional scrutiny and potentially negative implications of participating in a species conservation effort?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one we work with a lot. We really believe that relationship building between the landowner community and the NGO community is absolutely essential as a building block for that. And so we'd like to see more one-on-one relationships at the local level between these groups. But there's a bigger picture here that I think we have to be honest about, and I consider myself very much an environmentalist in sort of the classic sort of big picture sense, that I care about this planet and the wildlife on it. But I think we need to ask whether what we're doing out there is really trying to benefit a species, or is really advancing, is really become in some ways, and I hate to say this, but a kind of a business model. Conflict is good for raising money. And at the end of the day, we see that in politics, we see it out here on the landscape. And that's a very unfortunate thing. And I think for the environmental community, as well as for some of the industrial and agricultural side, we really need to ask if the rhetoric we're using out there, if the way that we're fundraising is really advancing the cause that we all need to be successful. So when it becomes a fundraising issue, even relationships between landowners and local NGOs aren't going to work, because at the end of the day, that fundraising has to happen to keep folks in business. So I think we have to all be honest with ourselves in terms of our advocacy work.
Jeff or Amos, do you want to jump in on that?
Well, again, I agree with Leslie's perspective, from the landowner, but you're dealing with a huge societal problem. And again, most people don't recognize it, but the West is the most metropolitan, urbanized portion of the United States. You have 2 or 3 cities, maybe 20 in California, and then the outback. And most of the environmental groups, including most of the environmental litigants on endangered species, come from these urban areas. And urban metropolitan America today really doesn't have a good grasp that it's rural landowners that are providing literally all the resources and the entire infrastructure that supports society in the West. And so an disproportionate burden, as Leslie's pointed out in a number of comments, devolves down to the landowner, and he's always on the receiving end of societal concerns and has to respond all the time. And that overburden, it's becoming really tough. And I think the only way you turn that Rubik's Cube to a solution is on an individual state level to get people to understand the value that working landscapes, working landowners are providing, because, you know, it's the water from the Upper Green River in Wyoming that eventually is feeding the cities of San Diego and Los Angeles. And it's, you know, elk from hundreds of miles away that are wintering on private ranches that appear in the national parks of the West. And this has become almost a completely broken philosophical societal problem.
Jeff, would you like to add anything to that? Or I've got one final question. We've got about 10 minutes remaining on our time today.
Well, I'll keep my, you know, I'll add to it, but I promise to keep it brief. I think we need to reward private landowners for the work that they are doing on the land. They, as Amos said, they are really the ones that are acting as the stewards for the species of concern that's being vocalized by, yes, in some cases, people who are local, but as Amos pointed out, in many cases, people who are hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from what's happening. And so there needs to be a reward system and incentivization for private landowners to be able to keep their land, keep doing what they're doing with their land, and be incentivized to keep that land together and to keep extracting a livelihood and a way of life, because the alternative is that land will all be chopped up. And if you think that trying to manage these species was tough now, it will get infinitely harder if we move from large tracts of land where we have people with very vested interests over large pieces of area suddenly now atomized into a lot of different landowners who will not be grazing, and they won't be raising a forest, and they won't be doing something else with the land, but what they will be doing with the land won't have anything that will be helpful to the species out in the West.
Thanks. I'll interject the final question here for the webinar, and this really gets down to funding. I think we've talked quite a bit about incentives, and that those ultimately will come down to dollars going to landowners to provide services that are beneficial to a species or valued by society. At the end of the day, I guess this is a question for each panelist, who do you feel should be writing those checks? Should this be a federal government issue? Should this be paid for by the states? Are there private markets that could be or should be providing the funding to see this happen? And just really throw that out to each of you as the final question, and then I'll let Zach wrap up our webinar today.
Do you want me to go first? I mean, I think the short answer to your question, this is Amos, is all the above. I think we need significantly enhanced, or I think we need additional federal money and flow to NRCS, because that federal program is the one federal program that has been a demonstrable success. I think the Partners program in the Fish and Wildlife Service should be increased. I think NIFWF should take the lead in a philanthropic center. You have ecosystem service markets and stuff, and private investors. I mean, we have dozens of these entities on our website. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to get funding to build them all into sort of one cluster for easy access. But given the constraints of the market, the 1%, 2% growth we have as a country, you're not going to find a single pot of gold, so you're going to need a melded funding flow. And again, that's best achieved at the local level. One of my favorite National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grants was to the Malpai Group in southwestern New Mexico, southeastern Arizona, where a group of 40-plus ranchers on their own initiative basically designed programs and outreach to federal and state agencies and started with private money. They've worked phenomenally well with federal and state agencies. And, I mean, they're my heroes for the West today. They're one of the board group. But, you know, what works there may not work in Montana. And, again, I'm a firm believer in diversity, and that includes diversity for conservation in terms of funding sources and implementation strategies. And thanks to WGA for today's seminar.
Sure.
I'll jump in on that
Lesli.
as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to second Amos's all of the above. He stole my line there, and agree also that the diversity is important just inherently in this, and particularly for stability. And I think we've seen maybe with the lesser prairie chicken and some others that, you know, when the oil and gas is what's supplying some of the market for credits on mitigation banks, when that goes down, all of a sudden there's not funds there. So I think for stability, to keep the conservation going, we have to have it kind of from all different angles. And I think another piece of it is that we've got to really think about the economic policies that make it possible for these working landscapes to be viable for sustainable agriculture. And I think that is kind of at a national level. We need to look at those economic policies as well as at the markets and the conservation funding side of this stuff. And I also agree the Malpai Borderlands Group is an outstanding example of success, and has we see similar models around the West emerging, and they all can show that kind of success. But they take long-term sustained funding. It's not something, you don't build those relationships overnight, you don't implement that conservation overnight, and then you've got to maintain it long-term. And one of the biggest problems we have is that politically that funding cycle changes a lot. We have foundations that come and go in that, and through all of that, these landowner-led collaborative conservation groups are struggling to keep the capacity and keep the good work alive. So I think that needs to be a very key focus for us.
Jeff, would you like to close us out with the who should pay the bills here?
Well, look, I think the most important thing, I would agree with what Lesli and Amos said. We need more funding in this area. We need it to be sustained funding for sustainability. We need diversity, which is important for sustainability. So many sources, all the above. The private landowners are carrying out not only producing valuable product for the states and for the nation, but they're also providing an incredibly valuable service in protecting these species, and they need to be rewarded for it. So we need more funding. We need it to be sustained funding, and we need some way of all of these different efforts to have. We need to unleash all that creativity, but we need some way of unifying all those efforts at the same time. It's having something that unifies the value of what we're doing, but allowing all that creativity to be unleashed for experimentation, for different approaches, because that's what will create the sustained approach and unleash the innovations that will allow private landowners to be funded for this effort and rewarded for this effort rather than penalized, and for that reward to be sustained.
Great. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to all the panelists, Lesli Allison, Jeff Morgheim, and Amos Eno for being a part of this today. We're right at an hour and a half. It's noon Mountain, and I'm going to let Zach from Western Governors Association close us out today, but thanks again for everybody for participating today.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I would just echo that. Thank you to everyone who attended, and thank you to our panelists. So this will be the 5th and final webinar in the Western Governors Species Conservation and ESA Initiative webinar series, and it's been great for us, and I want to thank everyone for all the insightful discussion, not only in this webinar, but in all the previous webinars as well. Some final housekeeping things. Please look for a wrap-up email that will come early next week with a link to the webinar recording on YouTube and a summary of some of the key discussion points brought up today. And finally, please be sure to view our online resource library at the Western Governors Association website. You can access that at westgov.org. Contained in that, you can find case studies, resources, best practices, and any other information and other recordings on workshop panel discussions and webinars that we have produced throughout this initiative. So with that, I would like to thank you all, and we're signing off.